History has a fun way of repeating itself. And by a fun way, I mean the kind of way that sends me into a rage that makes me want to flip a table like Teresa Giudice. Look it up. Back in February 2025, before I ever started working on this episode, like many other people, I could not fathom what to think when the President of the United States made himself the chair of the Kennedy Center. This was a person making it abundantly clear that controlling the microphone of artists would be essential to accomplishing the goals of his administration. After all, artists are notorious for always believing that we should stick to the status quo. That's what High School Musical was about, right? So imagine my feelings when I picked up a copy of James Shapiro's The Playbook, a story of theater, democracy, and the making of a culture war, and found out that the modern quote-unquote culture war being waged on a more inclusive world of art and society is simply the latest battle in a war that started during the Great Depression. Funnily enough, over theater. When I decided to do an episode on the New Deal's efforts to help theater artists during the Great Depression, I couldn't have imagined that what I would find would be a fight between progressives in America who, to paraphrase Shapiro, were finding their voice politically and artistically, and their opponents who worked endlessly to come up with strategies to keep the progressives from accomplishing their goals. And what really set me over was the fact that these strategies work so well, they haven't gone anywhere for 90 years, and they're still in use. What I didn't anticipate was that I would find a hero so ready to combat these tactics, a person who would be asked to do the impossible, a woman who was fearless in both her work and belief in the necessity of what she was doing, a woman who bucked convention and got a job that was set up to fail, a woman who made lemonade out of the smallest lemons you could possibly give her, as she brought theater to the US in its darkest hour, and was rewarded by having everything she worked for undercut and dismantled faster than she could have put it together. I have to tell you this right off the top. The heroes don't win this time. I'm Ricky, and this is Pocket Dramaturg Episode 4, Heroes Get Remembered, Hallie Flanagan and the Federal Theater Project. So let's situate ourselves before we keep going. Imagine it's the 1920s, the world has just ended to what was at that point the most terrifying event in world history in World War I. The US didn't need to continue its wartime economy, and Europe needed to recover. This meant that as the US enriched itself both through the loans it issued to Europe, it also invested in new consumer goods for Americans. After years of not spending during the war, the people were ready to spend now. Here, you get the rise of new automobiles, prohibitions here, the radio became a staple, jazz was the sound, and movies became the new favorite form of entertainment. Of course, this is the highlights, but for time's sake, I'm going to leave it here. Before we continue, let me make this abundantly clear. The Wall Street crash of 1929 didn't cause the Great Depression. A crash has to happen because something was wrong already, and it was more like the final domino that for some reason tipped the scale and lit a stick of dynamite. In the 1920s, a lot of wealth that we associate from the era was attained through speculation, which I needed to explain to myself. Which is essentially, when you buy an object in the hope that it will become more valuable for you to sell later. The thing that people were selling the most in this era being stocks. People were continuously pouring money into the stock market in hopes that they would be able to capitalize on what they were buying because they were in, and then sell them off before those things lost their value. And its continued activity, because things were always going so well, it would be enough to keep the people who were newly rich. The problem is that this only works if the economy is good. They didn't know, hindsight's 2020. But they shouldn't have felt bad, because everyone took out loans for everything. Businesses wanted to get bigger, families wanted to get money for the newest gadgets, a new house, a new car. After all of these purchases help other industries, such as the ones that, supply the raw materials for the new car you just took out a loan for. The most important one to think about for this conversation is the farmers who would take out loans to increase their output and buy more land. All of that machinery is not cheap. But using the farmers as an example, when you're able to produce that much food, as we all know, say it with me, the demand goes down. With how much was produced, there was no way for the farmers to pay back their loans. By 1929, the US was facing a problem. Even attempts by the US to stop people from taking out bad loans, it made Europe get a little nervous and try the same thing, which ended up putting Europe in a recession. And that's only one part of this whole debacle. When the crash actually did happen, it solidified an already growing unease from people towards spending, which is never a good thing in trying to avoid a depression. People need to spend money. And worst among it, and the thing that a lot of people have started to speculate is probably the biggest cause of the depression, is that banks whose rules operated a lot differently than they do now, they failed. Meaning people who were scared over the chaos happening on Wall Street, happening with their loans, they would go to their bank trying to get whatever money that they had left in their account and find out that the bank didn't have their money available for them. Banks at this time, their money wasn't insured. There was never a guarantee that your money would be there when you got there. And when the bank doesn't have enough money for you, it has to close. And if your bank closes, you need to go and find another one to hopefully get your money there. So people were crossing state lines left and right to try and get their money out of some banks. So when one bank is closed like that, people keep going around, and other banks across the country started to close because they were all running out of money. Not being able to access saving causes people to default on their loans and lose their house. Businesses, they had to cut costs, and we all know that the first thing a business does when they have to cut costs is they fire people. Then when the people don't have jobs, they don't have money to buy stuff. And the companies that are manufacturing what the people are supposed to be buying, they can't sell those things. So those companies go under. So by 1930, the US is in a full depression. So while the stock market crash wasn't helpful at all, that wasn't the only thing. It was most likely due to a very big problem the US had with its culture of speculation and the banks not having a very secure system of operating. I'll tell you, that took a lot longer for me to learn than it did for me to explain. I'm tired from that one. And that's only the start of the depression. So we're in our full-on depression, and we're going to need steady leadership to get out of there. And to lead the way, we were in the safe and knowledgeable hands of Herbert Hoover, who was quick to help by asking businesses to just, not lay off their workers. Just don't do that. We'll be good. Okay, I understand. That was unrealistic. Maybe he has another plan. What's he got next? Hoover wanted to encourage people to buy American goods. Okay, yeah, maybe that'll send some money back into our economy. So Congress decided that they would pass the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Living here in 2025, I don't need to keep doing research to know how this one's going to turn out. Just in case any specific person needs to hear this. Other countries don't like when you do the tariff thing. It makes them rise up their prices so that things just get more expensive for here. By 1933, unemployment peaked at 25%. Drought was wrecking the agriculture sector. Those loans that people used on their homes were defaulting. They were now homeless, and many of them began living in makeshift shantytowns that, thanks to their commander-in-chief, they lovingly named Hoovervilles. Finally, Hoover tried to enact policies that would provide some financial help to the banks. He was a guy who was really like, the government shouldn't be trying to help anybody else. He took way too long to do anything. And by the time he did, it was too little, it was too late. Hoover basically gifted the presidency to Franklin Roosevelt, who promised a new deal to the people. Literally, bro, anything is better than what we've got going at this point. Now, don't worry if you didn't pay attention in school. Unlike all the pre-calc and the grammar you swear would never come back in your life, which I bet it has, I'm here to keep reminding you of the stuff that you forgot from history class, because it's time to give you the framework of the New Deal that gives us the Federal Theater Project. So while on the campaign trail, FDR promised in one of his speeches a new deal for Americans for guidance and opportunity. This was a turning point that Eric Foner described as the moment when the government became an everyday presence in people's lives. The priorities of the New Deal were clear and conveniently described using 3 R's. We love when it's that easy to remember. All of these programs were centered around one, relief. These are the programs that were meant to give a hand to individuals whose lives were impacted by the Depression. Two, recovery. These were meant to try and get the economy back on track. And three, reform. These were the programs and policies that were made to make sure that the reasons of the Depression didn't happen again. So in the first New Deal, a great deal of focus went on the banks. The highlight being bank insurance, which we now know as the FDIC, to make sure that you can always get your money at the bank. It created the SEC and the Glass-Steagall Act, which put rules on banks engaging in speculation. I'm going to take a moment to acknowledge my high school history teacher, who I know isn't listening, but was obsessed with the Glass-Steagall Act. I finally understand it, Joe. I got you. Last was the National Recovery Administration, which looked to try and get industries, the government, and unions to come together with best practices and regulate prices. That one did not last long. Because the first New Deal wasn't going so hot, there was a need for a second one to try and push some legislature that would be a little bit more favorable in the public eye. Because, it's all about optics. The highlights of the second New Deal included Social Security, legislation ensuring workers' rights to unionize, establishing a minimum wage, a maximum weekly hour limit, and finally, outlawing child labor. There are so many other things that I don't have time for to talk about when it comes to both of these New Deals, but we're going to dive into the most important aspect for this story, which is the Works Progress Administration. The Works Progress Administration, or WPA, came as a part of the second New Deal and was a program responsible for trying to get Americans back to work. By its end in 1943, it had employed around 8.5 million people, and at this time, the government became the largest employer of people in the country. This largely targeted unskilled young men to get back to work by creating infrastructure and similar projects. The pay wasn't incredible, but it was something to send back home. These construction plans were far-reaching, and many of them still exist today, like LaGuardia Airport in New York or Midway in Chicago, the San Antonio River Walk or Griffith Observatory in LA. Those were just some of the really big projects. The WPA also built tons of libraries, roads, schools, parks, and so much more around the country. Look up your city. I'm sure that you'll find something that was built by the WPA. Another aspect of the WPA, which is the most significant here, is what was called Federal Project One. This was the program that prioritized getting artists back to work because, as WPA Director Harry Hopkins said, they, meaning artists, they gotta eat too. Project One had several branches that included the Federal Writers Project, which helped begin the process of creating oral histories, especially by former slaves. The Historical Record Society, which worked to preserve and organize historical records. The Federal Music Project, who hired musicians largely for performances and encouraged music appreciation. The Federal Art Project, who hired visual artists for commission works and other WPA projects. And, the star of our show, the Federal Theater Project. When Harry Hopkins needed to make a decision as to who would lead the FTP, he knew just the person for the job. His former classmate, Hallie Flanagan. Now, having done all this work and spent all this time looking her up, I think Hallie Flanagan was a rock star. But I'm sure a lot of you fall more in the vein of people back in 1935 who wondered, who the hell is Hallie Flanagan? I'm glad you asked. Hallie Flanagan was not someone who would have been considered to be the dream candidate for the director of the FTP. Ideally, they would have picked someone from the world of Broadway or someone from another commercial venue. But Hallie was a professor at Vassar College, a small school in Poughkeepsie, and had never worked on any projects with the demands that the FTP would require. But if you knew her, like how Harry Hopkins did, you knew that none of that mattered. Because you knew that Hallie was a force of nature. As a person, she was unshakable. Not only was she a widow, but she was a single mother who had lost one of her two boys. When she got her job at Vassar, there was no theater department. She was hired to teach English. Light work. She built the theater department herself. In 1926, she was the first woman to earn a Guggenheim Fellowship. This is a fellowship awarded to those who demonstrate accomplishment and potential future growth in different areas of the arts. Hallie took her award and spent a year traveling in Europe to learn and discover more about what theater artists were doing there. She was able to connect with artists like Yeats, Craig Myershold, and Stanislavski. She found a special connection with Russian theater and its emphasis on education and propaganda. When she was done, she brought everything back to Vassar and dubbed her program the Experimental Theater, where her students needed to be able to stage classics, but also stage new works that were usually written by their classmates. She emphasized the importance of performance in addition to literary analysis. In 1931, she wanted more. That's when she would go on to write her first and best-known play called Can You Hear Their Voices, which highlighted issues facing farmers at the start of the Great Depression. This play touched a nerve and essentially asked the people if they could hear the suffering from the farmers and called on the government to do something. Remember, this is still Herbert, Mr. I'm not going to do anything Hoover we're talking about here. And at the end, it is intentionally left vague if the solution to all of these issues is the existing government or the Communist Party. While many didn't necessarily believe that she was the best writer or director, everyone knew that what she was best at was finding timely shows to produce. From here, Hallie began a long relationship with how she portrayed her politics. She wrote an essay on how there was a distinction between commercial theater and a growing rise in the theater of the workers that wanted to usher in social change. While she was very good at making it clear that this is what she observed and not necessarily what she believed, her cleverness did leave a lot of people to think that she was in favor of upending the established order, which would get her into major trouble later. So in 1935, the search was on to find the head of the Federal Theater Project. With the budget approved, Harry Hopkins went to work to find the person that could lead the FTP. The search wasn't easy, but by the time Hallie's name joined the fold, Hopkins had little doubt that she was the person. In May of 1935, Hallie was called to Washington to have lunch with Hopkins, and by dinner, she was in the White House with Eleanor Roosevelt and the other Federal Project One leaders. Hallie and the Federal Theater Project were now on the clock. If there is one thing you need to remember as the most important thing to Hallie Flanagan's goals with the FTP, it's that she wanted to use it as a springboard to make theater an essential piece of every community that it could reach. And of course, the government wasn't going to make it easy. Already believing that no one would come to see the shows, their budget was razor thin, but the demands were still high. She would be responsible for putting together hundreds of plays, dance pieces, kids shows, even circus acts, while having to share $27 million of the WPA's budget with the other Project One organizations. So she doesn't get $27 million. She gets to share $27 million with like 5 other groups. One person that she interviewed told Hallie there was no way they could put on a show with only $200 a week. To which Hallie was like, Oh, I think you misunderstood. It's not $200 a week. It's $200 a month. When she was sworn in, she asked everyone in the staff to look at their new office, to look around at the ornate building they were in. And she said that this building we're in right here is representative of what we're not going to be doing here. We're not going backwards and doing what was done before. We need to be conscious of the state of the world right now. She wanted the entire project up and running in 3 months, but she quickly ran into the brick wall that was the process of getting funding. By the end of the year, regional offices for the FDP were present in cities across the country, but still no shows had opened. But in early 1936, the FDP would open the first in a series of shows that would become essential to its legacy, and was actually really representative of Hallie's goals of experimental, socially conscious, and controversial shows. It was called Ethiopia and would be first of what was called the living newspapers. To me, these sounded awesome. The concept was that you quite literally took a story from the newspaper. For Ethiopia's case, it was Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, and made a play out of it. And then the people discuss what's going on in the world on the way home. It's great and wonderful, and the exact kind of thing that gets censored immediately. Hallie had tried to promise theater that was free and uncensored to the people, but of course we all know that keeping things from being censored is easier said than done. For Ethiopia, the FTP was told that it had to soften its portrayal of real-life leaders. You can't make Mussolini look too bad. And to make sure that it wasn't too inflammatory. It was 1936. We were still like 5 years away from doing anything about the rise of fascism, literally anywhere, because they were still buying our industrial goods. While censorship didn't go over well with anyone, the show was a hit, and the living newspapers quickly became the bread and butter of the FTP, and pissed off people every single time. Shows like AAA and Injunction Granted were super pro-union and got under the skin of big business. Finally, the FTP had a little bit of momentum. By the end of 1936, the FTP had some real hits on its hands with One Third of a Nation and its all-black production of Macbeth. Its production of It Can't Happen Here, which was an adaptation of Sinclair Lewis's novel about fascism, showed that the work of the FTP was countrywide and it was growing. It premiered simultaneously at 21 different theaters across the country on the same day. This turned the FTP into not only one of the most successful WPA projects in terms of reach, with nearly all shows being at a reduced or a free price, but also in terms of getting people back to work. And it was growing closer to Hallie's vision of using the WPA's platform to push theater into every corner of the country. This success would be what gave the FTP confidence to tackle even more daring work and begin to draw the attention of those who look to take it down. Every hero needs someone to challenge them, and for Hallie Flanagan, the challenger will be Congressman Martin Dies Jr. from Texas. Here's a short background on the guy so we know what kind of person we're dealing with here. He's a congressional Nepo baby. His dad served in Congress. He got into Congress because the district figured out how to ignore the votes of the predominantly black district, meaning he only needed to appeal to the white supremacist demographic. In other words, his friends. His first big move in Congress was to try and stop immigrants from coming into the country. And he was like really dead set on this. Were those necessary facts? No. But neither was his racism. Dies' fixation on immigrants made him kind of a persona non grata. The newspapers and other members of Congress were kind of turned off by this, and he knew he needed to find something that would keep him relevant so that he could stay in Congress. He was a nobody, but as Shapiro noted, he was learning, and what he learned was that policy wasn't his quick route to fame. But using his status as a congressman to create almost a celebrity persona in the media, that would help him get his desired effect. He saw how the media began to shift away from supporting FDR and his New Deal and towards an overall shift towards the political right. And he said, let me hit the drift and steer right into this. He learned that he was a great speaker and was so personable that people really never double checked what he had to say. Dies grew in power by jumping aboard the House Rules Committee in 1935, which was one of the most powerful groups in the House because they essentially make the rules that Congress is supposed to follow as they do their work. Around this time, the fear of communism and the rise of the Nazis and fascism led Congress to believe that these beliefs could start to grow within the American public. The vice president, who was on his own nefarious agenda to undercut FDR, appointed Dies to chair the House Un-American Activities Committee, which I will now refer to as HUAC, or the Dies Committee interchangeably. It may seem like HUAC and the FTP were destined to be on a collision course, but this really wasn't the case. Dies knew that the job he was given was pretty much impossible, so for the first few months, the committee just kind of floundered. It was July 1938, and time was running out for the Dies Committee. He had until early 1939 to present its findings, and if he didn't prove that it was effective in rooting out sneaky, un-American activities, then the whole thing would look like a waste of money. It wouldn't be renewed, and Dies could lose any hope of building his resume in Congress. They knew it was impossible for HUAC to justify its existence by running a well-thought-out, well-researched investigation that was based on facts. It was time to start taking some cheap shots. One of the committee members, named J. Parnell Thomas, went rogue. He decided to pull an enemy out of the air and then figure it out from there. Thomas said that he had been doing his own investigations and that the Dies Committee would be investigating the Federal Theater Project and promised that the committee would be the ones to take it down. To which Hallie never saw coming, and Dies himself had to be like, "We're looking into them?" The Dies Committee was a lot like the Empire in Star Wars. It's just a lot of people who were all technically working on the same project, but because of their fear of failure or their desire to move up in the ranks, they were constantly undercutting each other for attention. Everyone wanted to be the guy, and it's a miracle they got anything done. Dies didn't know what to do at first and did try to target the growing influence of Nazi propaganda in the country. But this was mostly to try and get back attention on himself and look like he was in charge of his own committee again. When it came time to finally start hearings, he had to choose between Nazis that were definitely there or the rumor of communists in the FTP. Once hearings began, Dies quickly found out his case against Nazi propaganda was rough and so poorly thought out that he almost immediately pivoted to targeting the FTP. So it began. The Dies Committee hearings really began to gain some steam when it called a woman by the name of Hazel Huffman to testify. Huffman could talk, and she got attention, so she was just what the committee needed. She cut through all the arguing that the committee members had amongst themselves and read her prepared statement that essentially accused not only the FTP of communistic activity, but claimed that Hallie Flanagan was the driving force behind all of it. Hazel's mouth was writing checks that evidence could not cash. But they didn't care, and proceeded to let her go uninterrupted to point out every example that she could find in FTP plays that pointed to examples of communism. Examples that included anti-corporate attitudes, positive feelings towards integration, and anti-fascist messages. Seriously? Huffman would not stop, so Dies essentially decided to use his ally to his advantage. He started asking pointed questions that she would help turn into the sound bites he wanted for the newspapers. When she got off topic, he would rephrase what she had said so that she was always backing up his point. And at the end of her testimony, after putting all of her accusations into the universe and helping Dies with his goals, did Hazel make it abundantly clear she had her quote-unquote information because she was a spy. Hazel was employed by the Works Progress Administration in the mail division and worked undercover of her own accord. Nobody asked her to do this. And asked to be put in charge of the mailroom at the Federal Theater Project, which made the people working there be like, that's kind of a really weird thing to ask. It's kind of a red flag, bro. No. So Hazel went to Hallie Flanagan and was like, OMG, hey girl, you look so good and you are slaying here. I have to be a part of this. Can I run the mailroom? BTW, you are gorgeous. Hallie fell for it and told her colleagues basically, I don't see the problem. She was great. Hazel quit like 6 weeks later. Did she learn anything? Probably not. But according to, the other people working in the New York branch of the FTP, because she worked there at all, made it look like she had learned something and quit on principle. Shapiro in his book also noted that Hallie definitely had to have seen Hazel coming because she had told her husband that she had figured out Hazel was a spy when her staff showed her an affidavit from Hazel to the press saying that she had been opening Hallie's mail and had evidence that Hallie was a communist. Crazy. I'm going to leave the rest of the testimonies there because the rest of them are pretty similar in their content and their result, except that the rest of them weren't spies. Now, the methods of the Dies Committee were, in a word, cartoonishly evil. Their strategy involved giving a megaphone to the smallest rumor and turning it into the biggest threat to American safety that they could ever come up with. In the first week of hearings, the committee took testimonies that screamed to high heaven that the FTP was filled with communists. What has to be noted is that all these testimonies were based on hearsay evidence, and no one ever followed up on these allegations, and if they did, it was already too late, and the sound bites had already moved on to something completely new. The sources that they got were carefully selected to be taken out of context to make the point of the committee. And as the wild testimonies continued, of course, it became front page news. So much news that it had to appear as if Dyes was onto something that only he knew about and only he could solve. Classic. And of course, the Dyes Committee was not going to let anyone near leadership or of any kind of qualification anywhere near a hearing with a 10-foot pole. See, that's the thing about Dyes and those who use its methods. If you need to use fear and hearsay and all that to make your point, you really need to get that train moving before you start taking on big dogs. You need enough ammunition so that all of the facts in the world can't calm the chaos that you want to inflict. WPA administrators were reaching their wits' end, and even though they had done nothing to stop Dyes, and people like Hallie were dying to get in front of Dyes themselves, Hallie's initial directive was to stay quiet, though, and avoid possibly falling victim to Dyes' verbal trickery and tactics. But this did have an unintended backfire of giving the impression that maybe the FTP did have something to hide. So in September, Dyes, who was thinking he had had enough momentum to go after some bigger targets, decided that Hallie would have her turn with the committee. The date was set, December 6th, 1938. This would be the day that Hallie would square off with Martin Dyes. While Dyes came to the hearing with more than a slight reason to be nervous, Hallie came prepared, with a full arsenal to prove the accomplishments of the FTP and defend it from what Dyes had to say. She could stand on business that the FTP shows were safe for all audiences and that their work didn't even cost the taxpayer even 1% of the budget the government was using for job creation. Once the hearing started, Hallie had to wait. When it was Hallie's turn, the tune of the committee immediately shifted to hostile. Dyes stayed quiet at first to see what Hallie was capable of, while the other members of the committee, as the New York Times quoted, began to heckle her. They interrupted each other, trying to spit questions at her and try to throw her off. Hallie was answering questions left and right, several at a time, while continually being interrupted. Finally, Dyes called off the questions at first, and Hallie tried to begin to say her piece. This is where the pros of giving a theater person a platform gets cool. Hallie described her mission with the FTP was to fight un-American inactivity. A clever little turn of phrase that I'm sure would have had some people in the audience going like, Dyes was confused by what she meant, and she was ready to tell the audience that her highest priority was to put Americans to work per the instructions of Congress. She was ready for all the tactics. When the committee tried to cherry pick her words, when they tried to trip her up by testing if she was actually able to put people to work and put on great productions, she put them back in check. When they interrupted her and asked her if her goal was to establish a national theater, she dodged that as well. It's kind of like that part in Oppenheimer when Emily Blunt gets put on the hearing. Then came the accusations of Hallie being a communist. This was mostly done by Congressman Joe Starnes of Alabama. He almost sunk everything for the Dyes Committee that day. His colleagues needed to tell him to stop interrupting her while she was responding to his questions. She clapped back when Starnes tried to conflate her written observations about the existence of a workers' theater with Hallie being responsible for creating the workers' theater. She made it clear that these were her findings and not her opinions. In short, she was like, quote me if you want, but you better not mess up what I said. Shapiro notes that by this point, it became clear to Hallie that the question of the FTP promoting propaganda was where the whole conversation was heading. To which she owned up that, yeah, some of the plays were pushing some kind of propaganda, but only in the way of promoting democracy and education and the ideals that the New Deal was already working towards. Starnes was stumped. For now, though. The best is yet to come from him. Dyes needed to get some order back, so he took the baby steps of his scheme. He asked Hallie to describe how successful the FTP was. She proudly told him that over 25 million Americans had been to a show, and that the FTP, contrary to claims made by other hearings, was not only attended by communists. People from all walks of life and standing in the community attended and were partners. Dyes took note, though. He knew that Hallie's pride in literally doing her job would be evidence enough to support how dangerous an influence the FTP could have. But like a boomerang, Starnes came back around. Getting himself back into the fray, he quoted Hallie again with what he thought for sure was damning evidence that she was a communist, and proceeded to pick up a shovel and begin to dig himself the deepest hole anyone has ever dug themselves. I'm going to try and read this to as close as how it was spoken, because this is lunacy. This is the quote by Hallie he cited. Unlike any art form existing in America today, the Workers' Theater intends to shape the life of this country socially, politically, and industrially. They intended to remake the social structure without the help of money, and this ambition alone invests their undertaking with a certain Marlowe-esque madness. So Starnes reads off the quote and immediately asks, "You're quoting from this Marlowe. Is he a communist?" The audience burst out laughing. Now, you and I know that the Marlowe that Hallie was talking about is the Elizabethan-era playwright Christopher Marlowe. But Starnes didn't know that, and this question would follow him all the way to his obituary. Then, Hallie explained, after apologizing for being part of the people who were laughing, "I was quoting from Christopher Marlowe," to which Starnes gave back, "Tell us who Marlowe is so we can get a proper reference, because that is all we want to do." And Hallie replied, "Put in the record that he was the greatest dramatist in the period of Shakespeare, immediately preceding Shakespeare." That wasn't a great reading, but if you want to get a better idea of how this might have looked, this scene is recreated in Tim Robbins' movie, Cradle Will Rock, and does a very good job of showing the conviction on Starnes' side and how silly he looked, especially with the audience there. We love when people get to embarrass themselves on the record because we get to see it in 4K. Then Boo Boo the Fool said, "I could still salvage this." He asked if, because all drama has an origin in ancient Greece, is it inherently about social conflict and by extension communism? He in fact could not salvage this. I quote Starnes, "Surely Mr. Euripides was guilty of teaching class consciousness." Can't make this stuff up. Hallie basically said, "Yep, drama has always been about questioning the status quo," and left it there, mostly because she knew if she went into more detail, she was liable to get herself into a lot harder of a situation to get out of. They questioned her if there were communists in the FDP, which was a sneaky question to ask because it was, in fact, a catch-22. On the one hand, Hallie was legally, in her position, not allowed to ask about religion or political beliefs for those getting relief from the FDP. But Hallie was smart enough to know that there were around 66,000 members of the Communist Party in the US at that time, and surely there had to have been some in the Federal Theater Project. She knew how much time she had spent walking back people who wanted to use FTP projects to push their communistic values, and how much time she had spent negotiating with socialist and communist leading unions. This was actually more of a matter of necessity more than preference. She didn't love it, but it was her job, and she was smart for not saying anything. Starnes was done, and it was Representative Thomas's turn. After all, this was all his idea to go after the Federal Theater Project in the first place, so he must be ready. He turned to Revolt of the Beavers, a children's play, and tried to push the narrative that it was indoctrinating kids and pushing communism. Never heard that one before. Hallie came with receipts from the kids who, unlike Thomas, actually saw the play, who said the play taught them to never be selfish and that it was better to be good than bad. Rock on, little one. He tried to drum up anger from a line that made New Jersey legislatures look bad in the play Injunction Granted. Hallie looked at him sideways and said, "You realize that the line you're quoting that is disparaging New Jersey legislators came from a quote in the newspaper that was spoken by New Jersey legislators." Hallie realized these guys just don't understand how plays work, and that they don't understand that a single line doesn't dictate the whole meaning of a play, which she noted, saying that, and I'll say this loud enough for the people in the back, "We are in bad shape if we say that things are subversive and denounce them simply because they have a character that we don't align with. They're sometimes there to help you understand why those thoughts are bad." So at this point, things don't look good for the Dies Committee, but Dies had been sitting and waiting and watching, and now it was his turn. He started by asking Hallie if the FTP was for amusement, teaching, or to present facts to leave an impression. What he really meant was, should the FTP be pushing social, economic, or political ideas at all? Hallie asked him to exclude politics from this conversation. Dye said, sure. And then Hallie agreed that, yeah, this is what the FTP should be part of. Hallie had taken his bait. He wanted Hallie to justify why the taxpayers should be paying for the Federal Theater Project, especially if, in his words, it promoted the benefit of one class at the disadvantage of another. He wanted to know if the plays of the FTP were promoting public ownership of utilities. He played coy when Hallie called him out on trying to back her into a corner. He was basically just like, I don't know what you're talking about. Just answer my question, please. He then played the oldest trick in the rhetoric book and another scheme that still echoes to this day. He asked her where the FTP actually drew the line on what their shows advocated for and wouldn't let up. He demanded she draw the line, or he'd just have to assume that she wouldn't stop an FTP show even if the show's message was to overthrow the government. Bro. See, this is the genius of what Dye's and his successors had in their arsenal. Hallie never said she'd allow for a show to perpetuate a revolution, but because she wouldn't play his game, because she tried to continue to explain how the fundamental characteristic of theater was to challenge the status quo, he gathered more and more sound bites and got her to say all of the things that the headlines could use to prove his point about Hallie, about the FTP, and damage them in the court of public opinion. Hallie was stuck, and unfortunately, this is the ultimate goal of strategies like Dye's. They play into the smallest details and have questions so pointed that regardless of how you answer, you either come out saying the wrong thing or walk into another question that leaves the conversation in a never-ending loop. Hallie repeatedly tried to have an opportunity to read her prepared statement, as so many others who had been called to testify had been able to. Dye's knew this was out of the question and repeatedly denied her. He finished off with a critique about the use of vulgar language and material used in FTP shows, which was just a thinly veiled attack on the progress the Federal Theater Project had made in supporting Black artists and pushing for racial equality. And without a warning, Dye's concluded Hallie's hearing. Hallie asked one last time to read her prepared statement, and he'd said they'd see about it after lunch. Representative Thomas approached her and slimily remarked, "You don't look like a communist. You look like a Republican." Hallie told him that she wanted to come back after lunch, to which Thomas laughed and said, "We don't want you back. You're too tough of a witness, and we're all worn out." Bro, why are you talking like you were the one that beat her? Dye's literally saved you. Disgusting. Knowing she was done, she went to the secretary and asked that her written material be included on the record. He said it would. Of course, he was lying too. Dye's won the day and set in motion the end of the Federal Theater Project. In the coming months, the committee that allocated money to the various New Deal projects took aim at the FTP. In June 1939, the calls to dismantle the FTP were finally heard when a vote was called on whether the FTP should continue. Hallie was in attendance and watched the vote go 373 to 21 in favor of terminating the funding for the Federal Theater Project. Hallie tried not to give up as the bill moved to the Senate. She went to her theater colleagues and found a wealth of support from both theater and Hollywood. The Senate considered restoring the funding until a racist senator decided once again to walk the path of Dye's and led a campaign to kill the FTP once and for all. The process continued to show the worst in people. One by one, senators chimed in with more misquoted scripts and more rhetoric speaking on the damage caused by the red propaganda, promoting class consciousness and interracial relationships, and that the FTP was bent on changing the form of government and overthrowing the present government. Look, reading this process got really, really depressing, especially after seeing the cycle just continue to go through the same motions and keep working. So I'm going to get to the end. The legislators who wanted the FTP to go essentially reached a point where they were like, "We will give you whatever you want in some other place of the budget, as long as you agree to get rid of the Federal Theater Project." With an agreement in hand, a bill made it to the desk of Franklin Roosevelt and was signed on June 30th. The Federal Theater Project was over. Hallie tried to continue and tried to turn the FTP into a commercial venture, but it was in vain. The press was clear that it was the congressmen in Washington, the ones looking to find a reason to make themselves relevant, who were responsible for killing the FTP. Dye secured the continued life of the House Un-American Activities Committee and continued to point the finger of Congress to get whatever he wanted. After being officially fired, Hallie was able to finally speak her mind a little bit and wrote an op-ed in the New York Times and wrote that her congressional adversaries were afraid of the federal theater because it was educating the people to know more about government and politics and such vital issues of the day such as housing, power, agriculture, and labor. They are afraid, and rightly so, of thinking people. They still are, Hallie. They still are. In 1940, Hallie published a book on the story of the FTP from her perspective. Looking back on it, she said, "Thus the Federal Theater Project ended as it had begun, with fearless presentation of problems touching American life. If this first government theater in our country had been less alive, it might have lasted. But I do not believe anyone who worked on it regrets that it stood from first to last against reaction, against prejudice, against racial, religious, and political intolerance. It strove for a more dramatic statement and a better understanding of the greater forces of our life today. It fought for a free theater as one of many expressions of a civilized, informed, and vigorous life. Anyone who thinks that those things do not need fighting for today is out of touch with reality." Hallie Flanagan returned to Vassar. Some who knew her assumed that she might have gone on to become a fierce opponent of the WPA after that and start writing critically about it, but she never did. She was well aware that in politics, sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, and she knew that this was just a loss she was going to have to take and move on. Sure is better than me. She moved to Smith College and oversaw productions there. In 1946, she was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. In the early 1950s, Columbia was interested in having Hallie possibly lead their new art center, but her health wouldn't allow it. Her health continued to decline. By the early 60s, her mental health began to deteriorate as well. She never forgot the ordeal with dyes. She sometimes worried that the voices in the hallway of her nursing home were accusing her of being a communist. Hallie Flanagan died on July 23, 1969, at the age of 79. After an unsuccessful attempt to switch to the Senate in 1941, Martin Dies remained in the House of Representatives and as the chair of HUAC until 1944. He returned to the House of Representatives in 1952 and supported, on paper, a manifesto that looked to reverse the decision in Brown versus the Board of Education. Of course he did. His time in Congress officially ended in 1959. He returned to Texas and died in 1972. In 1948, HUAC finally turned a major corner with public perception when it caught a case of perjury from Alger Hiss, who was on trial for espionage. By securing this win, along with the breakdown of the US's relationship with the Soviet Union, HUAC stepped into its It Girl era. HUAC continued its hearings that would exploit people's lives, careers, sexuality to create fear and introduce the finger-pointing era that we know of, and inspired former Federal Theater Project artist Arthur Miller to write The Crucible. In 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy's rise solidified that the U.S. was in the midst of a second Red Scare. Don't even get me started on J. Edgar Hoover's second wind. Just so we're clear, figures like Dies, McCarthy, and HUAC don't have the power to unilaterally introduce or pass legislation. So, like Dies, they needed to continue their underhanded tactics to ruin the lives of people they wanted to ruin. At the risk of spiraling into a rage about how McCarthy lives on through his work with Roy Cohn, who served as a lawyer and a mentor to Donald Trump, I'll leave this here and let you do your own research on that end, because McCarthy's persona, his own media circus, really does deserve all the attention it gets. Without a figure like Dies or McCarthy to look for a new target to maintain power, HUAC started to decline. And even after an attempted rebrand in '69, what remained of HUAC was gone by 1975. But the tactics lived on. One of the members of the House of Representatives that voted to defund the Federal Theater Project was a young future president by the name of Lyndon Johnson. Nearly 20 years after he voted to defund the FTP, he would sign into law the creation of the National Endowment of the Arts, which was the first time that the government would invest in the arts since the New Deal. Those in charge of the National Endowment of the Arts learned from the Federal Theater Project and were able to build a framework that was able to withstand multiple attempts to destroy it. And with the way the current administration has made it abundantly clear, it's time for another round. I said at the beginning of the story that the hero doesn't win. People like Dyes, who mastered how to manipulate narratives, hyperbolize, and turn people against their neighbors, won and gave the playbook to politicians and leaders of all kinds who continue to find ways to undermine what they cannot control. Those smart enough will know how to take advantage of given circumstances, depression, war, and tragedy to manufacture an enemy. They will know how to use holes in the system and cherry-pick information to try and best suit their narrative, and will look for you to dig your own grave while they do it. And the worst part about it is, a lot of times they're going to get their way. But that doesn't need to be the end of it. The methods taken by Dyes for nearly 100 years have become the standard for those looking for cheap wins and to solve problems that they manufacture to reach levels of powers they know they can't earn. Maybe it's time to recognize that there are a few plays that we can learn from the story of the Federal Theater Project, from Hallie Flanagan, that we can add to our books. I'll leave you with one last excerpt from Hallie's book. Neither should the theater in our country be regarded as luxury. It is a necessity because in order to make democracy work, the people must increasingly participate. They can't participate unless they understand. And the theater is one of the great mediums of understanding. When the Dyes of the world come to silence, I hope that you will prepare yourself and stand in your abilities and conviction of the good that you do, like Hallie Flanagan. That's the end of the episode. For more information on the Federal Theater Project, I recommend you take a look at the playbook, A Story of Theater, Democracy, and Making of a Culture War by James Shapiro. It was an essential piece in the creation of this episode. I also recommend you watching Tim Robbins' 1999 movie, Cradle Will Rock. Takes quite a bit of liberty in terms of historical accuracy, but it touches on a lot of really great stuff. Other sources include Arena, The Story of the Federal Theater by Hallie Flanagan, and Hallie Flanagan, A Life and Time in the American Theater by Joanne Bentley. Thanks for listening to this episode of Pocket Dramaturg. This episode was hosted, written, edited, and produced by Ricky Ortega. Associate producer is Bridget Martinez. You can follow the show on Instagram at pocket_dramaturg, TikTok and Blue Sky at Pocket Dramaturg, and you can subscribe to the show on YouTube as well. Last, if you enjoy the show, leave a comment and share it with someone you know. See y'all next time.